The indebted demand paper that we have, it starts from a simple, I would say almost obvious observation that borrowers and lenders in an economy are not the same people. And they are not the same people in the sense that borrowers are on average less well off, they are less wealthy. And perhaps more importantly, borrowers, they tend to consume a significantly larger share of their lifetime income compared to lenders. And so this asymmetry between borrowers and lenders, namely that lenders are A, wealthier or richer, and B, that they tend to consume a smaller fraction of their lifetime income. The indebted demand framework shows that this simple but very realistic set of facts, they have very important implications for the macroeconomy, and in particular, the connection between the macroeconomy and the financial markets. The first implication is that let's imagine that for some reason, credit or debt rises in an economy, which by the way is very factual as well. So just to give you one example, if you were to start from the 1980s and go all the way to recent times, we have seen a more than doubling of credit to GDP. And this is a story not just true for the US, but it's globally true. It's happening in China, it's happening in Europe, it's pretty much happening everywhere. So let's just take for now as given that credit or debt rises substantially, like we have seen over the last 4 to 5 decades. The indebted demand framework has some very specific implications for that rise in debt. So in particular, again, keep in mind that borrowers, they tend to consume a larger fraction of their lifetime income. What that means is during the time when those borrowers are borrowing, they borrow and they spend. And so the economy kind of experiences a sort of a boom, stimulus, if you will. So, it's good times. However, the same borrowers are supposed to return the money at some future point in time. That's the interest rate that they have to pay back. And that's where the indebted demand force kicks in, because now what they are doing is the money that they borrowed and they have already consumed against it. When they have to return that money back to the lenders, remember that asymmetry. The lenders, when they receive that money back, they are not going to consume as high a fraction of that money coming back to them as the borrowers had initially consumed. So now we have a problem, which is when lenders start to receive that borrowed money back, they are going to consume that money at a lower rate. So all else equal, that will tend to put downward pressure on aggregate demand, and the economy will tend to kind of stall, if you will, because of that lack of demand. So what this economy must do to bring demand back to a higher level is somehow convince the same borrowers to borrow a bit more. But that is not possible because they have some fixed income. The only way to do that is for the interest rate to fall in equilibrium, as we say in technical lingo, to maintain the same balance of supply and demand, and at the same time allow for the borrowers to pay back the money that they borrowed earlier, and in fact to convince them to borrow even more, interest rate must fall. So the first main implication of this indebted demand framework is that when you rely on more borrowing to build demand, that in itself builds this addiction to debt that requires ever falling interest rates. Because to sustain the previous debt and in fact to borrow even more so the borrowers can stay afloat, it has to be the case that the interest rate needs to be lower. And so what you get at the aggregate in the macro or the global economy is two facts would tend to go hand in hand. One, rise in credit or debt as a share of GDP, and second, a fall in interest rate. And both of those facts we have seen very clearly globally, as I said, over the last 4 to 5 decades. So this is the first major implications of this indebted demand framework, that it helps us rationalize or explain this co-movement of rising debt, this rising dependence on credit for generating demand in the economy, and ever falling interest rates. So that's, again, the first main implication. The second implication of this framework actually goes a step deeper. And if you go back to the first implication, I started off by saying, let's take the rise in credit as given for now. But let's now dig deeper and go behind the more fundamental causes or structural reasons for why credit or debt may have risen in the first place. It turns out that the same indebted demand framework is actually very useful in suggesting reasons for why this particular economy is apparently addicted to debt in the first place. And it turns out that the seeds for that rise in credit lie in the rise in inequality. So this is a framework that essentially connects two broad features of the global economy. One, the rise in inequality. And when I say inequality, I'm referring to the share of income going to the very top 1% of the global citizenry. And we know that that share has almost doubled as well over this time period that I'm talking about. And now going back to the indebted demand framework, remember, if the very rich are getting richer, but they don't spend as much out of their overall lifetime income, a natural consequence of this rising inequality would be that there would be a downward pressure on aggregate demand. And the only way to push back against that downward pressure on aggregate demand would be to, once again, for the borrowers to come in, because they are the ones who spend, who are more willing to spend, if you will, for them to come in and to start borrowing. And that's how the economy begins to function in this environment of rising extreme inequality, that the financial sector in particular is always trying to find ways to convince borrowers to borrow more and consume more so the economy can sustain that full level of demand that it needs to sustain full employment. But as I said earlier, that process can only go on in the face of continuously falling interest rate. So this is the second key implication, again, that connects the rise in inequality, in credit, and the fall in interest rate. Those three are the most important facts in my mind in the macroeconomy, and the indebted demand framework helps us to understand the connections between these trends. So once you realize these connections, and as I have already mentioned, there is significant empirical support for these forces that I've described, the forces of indebted demand. I've already mentioned some, but just to give you one more, if you look historically, like over the last couple of centuries or so, or at least a century and a half, what we see is that the up and down of global inequality is very much followed by this rising and falling interest rates, and this dependence on credit, if you will, to sustain demand as well. Similarly, if you were to focus more narrowly to the contemporary world, and in particular, let's come to the US. What is interesting fact about the US is that while there has been this broader rise in inequality, this rise in inequality has not been the same across various US states. Some US states have seen a larger rise in inequality than others. And when we focus on those states that have experienced a rising level of inequality, what we find is that those are exactly the states that have also seen a greater accumulation of savings by the very rich, which are then forced to be channeled into credit or debt to again sustain the level of demand as before, as I mentioned earlier. So there is significant empirical evidence that verifies kind of some of the key implications of the indebted demand framework. The first important policy implication is that the process that the indebted demand framework kicks in, which again is in this environment of rising inequality, debt has to continue to go up, interest rates have to continue to fall to in order to sustain that higher and higher level of debt. The problem with that dynamic is that it cannot go on forever. There's a very natural dead end to this dynamic, to this process that is a natural implication of the indebted demand framework. And that dead end is that interest rates cannot keep on going down forever. There is a natural bound for various reasons below which interest rates either cannot go further, go lower, which is zero essentially. The interest rates cannot go below zero for various reasons. But one important reason is that if you try to make interest rates negative, it creates all kinds of problems. For example, financial markets become too sort of bubbly, and you can have many other issues in the economy as well. So then this process meets a natural end, and sometimes that's referred to as zero lower bound problem. And the economy at that point starts to shrink, because now that you are stuck at that zero interest rate, which is essentially where we have been in terms of the policy rate since 2008, at that time, the economy faces this fundamental headwind, which is that now you're finding it harder and harder to generate demand. So again, the first natural policy implication is that the economy gets stuck in this zero lower bound environment. And in a way that we classify that environment as a debt trap, because remember, it's that by the time you enter that zero interest rate environment, you have accumulated so much debt that now you cannot get out of that situation by bringing interest rates back to normal. Because if you ever tried to do that, the burden of the debt servicing of that debt would be too extreme for the borrowers and hence the economy to maintain. So you get stuck in that equilibrium, and conceptually you can remain in that hard place for a very long time. So that's policy implication number one, which is kind of, if you will, a pessimistic policy implication. But on the positive side, there are definitely levers that the policymakers can use to help us get out of this situation that I'm referring to as the debt trap. What are those policy solutions? The first obvious one is that anything that attacks the structural problem of rising inequality would also help us get out of this kind of a debt trap. That's a natural implication of rising inequality, and hence the indebted demand force that kicks in. So, there's a lot of work on the causes and sort of, how we can address the rising inequality. Any material change in that would help us get out of this debt trap situation as well. So, for example, public investment in infrastructure and education that raises intergenerational mobility, that increases the wages earned by the bottom 50 or 70% of the population, potentially raising the minimum wage. All of those policies can help, not just at the individual level, the individuals that you're trying to help, but the sort of the broader lesson that comes out of it is that we all benefit from those kind of policies, because the economy will become more balanced and it will not be trapped in this high debt, zero interest rate environment that I talked about earlier. And the other side of policy implications is that progressive taxation is very important. The US currently has almost a flat taxation system once you count all the payroll taxes, the local taxes, the property taxes, and so on. And the taxation system in the US is just not progressive enough to deal with this particular situation. So the other implication is that the taxation system needs to be more progressive. And the last implication I'll mention on the taxation side is that wealth tax turns out to be one possible solution that can be applied to deal with this endemic problem of inequality and its perverse macroeconomic consequences. So wealth taxes actually work very well to get us out of this problem. Because remember, one of the core reasons behind this problem is that you have, from a macroeconomic perspective, an overaccumulation of wealth at the very top end. And that wealth is being held in the form of credit or debt that is no longer sustainable at normal interest rates. And that sort of is holding everyone back. And so wealth taxes are potentially quite useful in such an environment as well.